The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room grew quiet as Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone in front of her. The freshman congresswoman from Texas sat upright, her burgundy suit neatly pressed, while across the table, Ted Cruz flipped through his papers with the relaxed confidence of someone who had rarely lost a debate in this chamber. What followed, however, would become a defining moment. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss important political moments like the one about to unfold. Because what you're about to witness is something few have seen. Ted Cruz, momentarily without words. The tension in the room was clear. Cruz had already interrupted Crockett 5 times during her opening remarks on voting rights legislation, each interruption more dismissive than the last. Everyone present sensed a sixth was coming, but Crockett was ready, prepared to turn what might have been a routine hearing into one of the most talked-about exchanges of the year. Senator Cruz, Crockett began, her tone calm yet firm. I've counted your interruptions today. We're at 5. I'm interested to see if you'll reach 7 before I finish explaining why your arguments are not only incorrect, but fundamentally misinformed. The room reacted. Cameras lifted from every direction. C-SPAN viewership rose almost instantly. Cruz's confident expression slowly shifted into something less certain, noticeable discomfort. This was no longer just another committee hearing. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative from Dallas, would attempt what many had tried and failed to do for years. Challenge Ted Cruz on his own terms, using his own methods in front of a live national audience. To fully understand the significance of this exchange, it helps to know who these two figures are. Jasmine Crockett was not widely expected to reach this stage. Just 2 years earlier, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, taking on cases that larger firms often avoided, defending clients who could not afford representation, and confronting systemic injustice case by case. When she announced her run for Congress, many political insiders dismissed her chances. A young black woman from Texas, they argued, could not realistically influence Washington. But Crockett had no intention of following outdated expectations. She aimed to change them. In her early months in Congress, she studied intensively, learning every rule and procedural detail. While others focused on speeches, she spent long nights in the Library of Congress reviewing decades of debate transcripts. She understood that to change the system, she needed to understand it better than those who built it. Ted Cruz, in contrast, represented the established political structure. A graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law, former Solicitor General of Texas and longtime senator, he built his reputation on intellect and control in debate. His well-known tactic was interruption, a precisely timed challenge designed to disrupt opponents, break their focus, and take control of the discussion. He had used this method effectively for years against experienced senators, cabinet officials, and policy experts. The interruption was not simply a habit. It was a refined strategy. And for over a decade, no one had successfully countered it. The stakes that day extended beyond the proposed voting rights bill. This was a broader test of influence, who had the authority to speak, and who would be silenced. The legislation aimed to restore voting protections that had been reduced over the past decade. For Cruz, opposing it meant maintaining his party's electoral advantage in Texas. For Crockett, it was about protecting her constituents' right to be heard, people who often waited hours in line just to vote. Beneath the policy disagreement was a deeper conflict, established power versus emerging voices. The question was whether traditional dominance and procedural control would continue to shape Washington, or whether someone like Crockett could challenge that environment. The hearing had been in progress for over 90 minutes. Cruz was performing at his usual level, interrupting witnesses, redirecting questions, and guiding the discussion. Political affiliation didn't matter. When Cruz chose to speak, the room typically fell silent. That was the norm. Then Crockett began her presentation. She was the final speaker of the day, and many assumed Cruz might ease his approach. After all, they were both from Texas, and some level of professional courtesy was expected. But something about her composure appeared to unsettle him. She was not deferential. She did not begin with formal pleasantries. She spoke with clarity and authority, as though her place there was unquestionable, and that was something Cruz could not overlook. The first interruption came just 3 minutes in. Crockett was explaining the effects of polling place closures in Texas when Cruz cut in sharply. "Representative Crockett, surely you're not suggesting." "Senator," she responded evenly, "I'm in the middle of presenting data. I'll take your questions when I've finished." Her tone remained professional but firm. Around the room, attention shifted. It was uncommon for anyone to push back against Cruz's initial interruption. He smiled, his familiar expression that blended amusement with dismissal. He leaned back, appearing patient, though the tapping of his fingers suggested irritation. 2 minutes later came the second interruption. Crockett was presenting a map of polling site closures when Cruz leaned forward again. "This data is misleading. Representative." "Senator Cruz," Crockett interjected smoothly, "you'll have a full opportunity to respond. For now, I'm presenting evidence that deserves to be heard completely." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even lift her eyes from her notes. Her delivery stayed controlled, confident, and steady. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Staffers who had been looking at their phones suddenly paid attention. Other senators leaned forward in their seats. Something out of the ordinary was taking place. Senator Cruz's interruptions were usually expected, almost routine, but very few people ever challenged them directly. The third interruption came more forcefully than before. Representative Jasmine Crockett was presenting her data on voter wait times when Ted Cruz cut in sharply. "This is completely unreasonable. You can't just present one side." "Senator Cruz, that's 3. Crockett said calmly, her tone cutting through his words. She finally looked up and met his gaze. "I'm keeping count." A quiet pause filled the room. Had she really counted his interruptions out loud? No one had done that before. It was a small move, but it shifted the dynamic. She was highlighting his behavior in real time, making it visible and difficult to ignore. "I'm simply trying to ensure accuracy," Cruz began. "That's 4. Crockett replied, then continued her remarks as if nothing had happened. The tension in the room increased. Committee Chair Dick Durbin appeared uncertain, as if considering whether to step in. But technically, nothing Crockett said broke any rules. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was simply counting. Still, everyone could sense the balance shifting. Cruz's fifth interruption came with a different tone. He lowered his voice, trying to sound more measured. "Representative Crockett, I think we'd all appreciate if you could clarify." 5, she noted, making a small mark on her paper. "Senator Cruz, you've interrupted me 5 times in 10 minutes. I'm curious, is this a Senate record or your personal best?" A light ripple of laughter moved through the room. Someone at the back even clapped briefly before being quieted. Cruz's expression tightened. He was in a difficult position. If he interrupted again, he would reinforce her point. If he stayed silent, he would lose control of the exchange. But he continued. As Crockett began citing voter testimonies, Cruz leaned toward his microphone again. "These anecdotes don't represent." 6, Crockett said firmly, setting her papers down. The room went still. "Senator Cruz, you've now interrupted me 6 times. Before you reach 7, I want to make it clear that I came prepared." She reached into her folder and lifted a stack of documents. "I have transcripts from the last 15 committee hearings you've attended. Would you like to know how often you've interrupted female witnesses compared to male ones?" Cruz paused, then said nothing. "The ratio is 4 to 1. You interrupt women 4 times more often than men, and black women 6 times more often. And black women from Texas." She paused briefly. "Let's just say I'm not the first." A low wave of reaction moved through the room. Staffers quickly began typing on their phones. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." Cruz looked unsettled. His confidence weakened as he opened his mouth, then stopped. "That's a completely unfair characterization," he finally said quietly. "Is it?" Crockett asked evenly, pulling out another page. "January 15th, you interrupted Professor Angela Davis 17 times in 30 minutes. February 3rd, Dr. Patricia Williams 12 times. March 22nd, State Representative Nicole Collier 21 times. Would you like me to continue?" Cruz's expression shifted noticeably. His usual composure faded. He looked around the room, but no one met his gaze. Even members of his own party avoided eye contact. Senator John Kennedy focused on his coffee. Senator Josh Hawley looked up at the ceiling. "This is an ambush," Cruz said at last. "No, Senator," Crockett replied in a steady tone. "An ambush is when someone interrupts 6 times while another person is presenting verified data on voter suppression. What I'm doing is preparation. There's a difference." She returned to her presentation, though it was clear the exchange was not over. The atmosphere remained tense. Staffers held their phones up. Cameras zoomed in on Cruz's face, which reflected shifting emotions. "Now, as I was saying before the 6th interruption," Crockett continued, her voice calm and precise, "the data clearly shows a consistent pattern of voter disenfranchisement, particularly in Houston County." Cruz struggled to remain silent. Losing control, being publicly challenged, and having his interruptions counted, it was more than his usual approach could manage. His career had been built on control, on leading every exchange. He could not allow this moment to stand. He likely recognized the situation, but instinct pushed him forward. He leaned toward his microphone, his voice carrying a hint of sarcasm. "Representative Crockett, your presentation might appeal to your Twitter audience, but..." 7. The single word paused the exchange. Jasmine Crockett stood up slowly and deliberately. She stepped slightly to the side of her table, so she was clearly visible. The room became completely quiet. Even the usual background noise and typing stopped. Security staff leaned in to observe more closely. "Senator Cruz," she said clearly, "you have now interrupted me 7 times. 7 times you have attempted to cut me off. 7 times you have tried to prevent the public from hearing what is happening in our state." She picked up a remote and pressed it. A video appeared on the screen behind her. It showed Ted Cruz speaking at a recent event. The radical left, his recorded voice said, wants to silence conservative voices. They cannot win on ideas, so they try to stop us from speaking. Crockett paused the video. "An interesting position, Senator," she said calmly. "So tell me, what exactly is happening right now?" The room remained still. Only the quiet hum of the air system and a few faint movements could be heard. Cruz sat motionless, caught between frustration and disbelief, a moment observers would later describe as when he lost control of the narrative. But Crockett continued. "You know what the real issue is, Senator," she said, moving slowly along the table. "You've been doing this for so long that you no longer notice it. The constant interruptions, speaking over others, ignoring voices that differ from yours. It has become routine." She pressed the remote again. This time, a compilation appeared. Clips of Cruz interrupting witnesses over the years. Women, people of color, activists, and senior citizens. The interruptions followed one after another in quick sequence, forming a consistent pattern of his voice cutting people off mid-sentence. "That's inaccurate. You're misunderstanding. Let me explain what you mean. That's not correct." The video ran for about a minute. When it ended, even some of Cruz's colleagues appeared uncomfortable. Senator Susan Collins wrote quickly in her notebook. Senator Mitt Romney covered his mouth, his expression thoughtful. "More than 143 interruptions in the past 6 months alone," Crockett said, reading from her notes. "That is an average of 1 interruption every 12 minutes of testimony. But here is a key detail. When Fortune 500 CEOs testify, your interruption rate drops to once every 45 minutes. When oil executives speak, it becomes once an hour. But when it is someone like me, it occurs every 3 minutes." Cruz responded, "This is character assassination." "No, Senator," Crockett replied evenly. "This is mathematics. Numbers do not have bias. They reflect what is measurable, and what they show is a clear pattern." She moved back toward her seat, but remained standing. Then she pulled out a thicker folder. "Would you like to know what else I found in my research, Senator?" Cruz gripped the edge of his desk, his hands tense. "This is not what this hearing is about." "Oh, but it is," Crockett said, interrupting him for the first time. "This hearing is about voting rights, about whose voices are heard and whose are not. And you, Senator Cruz, have just provided a clear example of how that silence happens. She opened the folder. Let's review your voting record on election legislation. In 2019, you voted against the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, you opposed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In 2021, you voted against the For the People Act. And during those hearings, you interrupted supporting witnesses an average of 8 times each. Those bills were examples of federal overreach. Cruz began. I'm not finished, Crockett said firmly. You see, Senator, I did not come here to argue. I came to present evidence. Evidence showing how you have repeatedly supported actions that make voting more difficult, while also interrupting or dismissing those who raise concerns. She unfolded a large map of Texas and pointed to specific areas. In these counties, polling locations were closed. Your campaign received significant donations from organizations that supported those closures. Is that coincidence? Cruz stood abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to these claims. Then don't sit, Crockett replied. Stand and be accountable. Stand and explain to the people of Texas why they should wait 8 hours to vote. Stand and explain why their voices matter less than your donors. The room became highly focused. Staffers stood for a clearer view, and C-SPAN cameras shifted quickly between Cruz and Crockett. Online, 7 Interruptions was already trending worldwide. Cruz made another attempt to regain control. Drawing on his experience, he said, Representative Crockett, your conduct today reflects what is wrong with modern politics. Instead of discussing policy, you are turning this into a spectacle. This approach may gain attention online, but serious legislators are trying to work. This is why freshman representatives should learn to. To what, Senator? Crockett interrupted. Learn to be quiet. Learn to accept constant interruptions. Learn their place. She picked up her phone and held it up. Do you know what this is, Senator? This is democracy in the 21st century. Right now, over 3 million people are watching this live. 3 million Americans are seeing how you respond to disagreement. 3 million voters are witnessing how you treat their right to be heard. Crockett placed her phone down and lifted one final document. This, she said, is a letter signed by every Democratic member of the Texas House of Representatives. Cruz did not respond. He remained standing, but his posture had weakened, his expression tense, his confidence reduced. This letter, Crockett continued, states that they support federal voting rights legislation because they have seen the consequences when protections are removed. It states they are concerned about their constituents being systematically silenced. She paused briefly, and to quote directly, we stand with Representative Crockett as she speaks truth to power, regardless of how many times she is interrupted. Applause followed. It was not limited to one group. Staffers, reporters, and even some security personnel joined in. The sound filled the chamber as Chairman Dick Durbin struck his gavel, attempting to restore order. Cruz leaned toward his microphone, raising his voice. This is a violation of committee rules. Chairman Durbin, I demand. 8. Crockett said calmly. The laughter that followed reflected recognition more than mockery, the kind that comes when a pattern becomes clear. Cruz paused, without a response. After a moment, he gathered his papers, turned, and walked out. The heavy door closed behind him. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The room remained quiet, aware of the significance of the moment. Crockett waited for order to return before speaking again. Mr. Chairman, she said in a composed tone, I would like to continue my presentation on voting rights. Without interruption. It should take approximately 10 more minutes. Durbin nodded. The witness may proceed. Before she resumed, Senator Elizabeth Warren stood and began a slow, deliberate clap. One by one, others joined, Democrats, Independents, and a few Republicans, enough to show a noticeable shift in the room. When the applause ended, Crockett continued. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, she presented her findings clearly and precisely. No one interrupted. After finishing, she gathered her materials and moved toward the exit. Just before leaving, she turned back with a slight smile. Oh, and Senator Cruz's interruption count today, this is actually below his average. Last year, he interrupted Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee 14 times in 20 minutes. So technically, this was an improvement. The room reacted again as she exited, her steps echoing across the chamber floor. Behind her, discussion quickly spread, the moment already circulating online. Within an hour, her testimony became the most-watched congressional hearing in C-SPAN history. Media outlets referred to it as the 7 interruptions heard around the world. Political analysts described it as one of the most effective public challenges of a senior senator broadcast live. But the key outcome was not the exchange itself, it was what followed. Crockett's data, arguments, and evidence on voter suppression became the main focus of national discussion. Attention shifted from the confrontation to the issue itself. Senator Cruz later released a statement, accusing Crockett of staging a political moment for attention rather than focusing on policy. However, his response was overshadowed by additional coverage. Newly resurfaced footage showed repeated interruptions of female witnesses during past hearings. A widely shared compilation titled Ted Cruz Interrupts Women for 10 Minutes Straight reached over 50 million views within 24 hours. Even some Republican colleagues began to distance themselves. Senator John Cornyn was among the first, stating that everyone deserves to be heard during committee hearings without unnecessary interruptions. Senator Lisa Murkowski was even more direct. What we saw today was overdue. But the most unexpected reaction came from former Republican Senator Bob Corker. He posted, "I served with Ted Cruz for 6 years. What Representative Crockett did today is something many of us wanted to do, but didn't have the courage to. Bravo." Crockett's position was clear. Still, she avoided personal celebration. In every interview, she redirected attention to the central issue, voting rights. Speaking with Jake Tapper on CNN, she said, "This is not about me versus Senator Cruz. It's about ensuring every American has equal access to the ballot. If highlighting interruptions helped bring attention to that, then it served a purpose." The aftermath of what became known as the 7 interruptions hearing spread quickly across American politics. Within 24 hours, the moment moved beyond politics into popular culture. The number 7 became a reference point used in workplaces and even casual settings whenever someone refused to stop interrupting. Saturday Night Live created sketches about it, and Stephen Colbert dedicated an entire monologue to the exchange. However, the most notable change occurred within Congress. The next day, during a Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting, Senator Rand Paul began to interrupt a witness, then paused and said, "I'm sorry. Please continue." Witnesses across Washington observed a shift. Committee hearings began to feel more structured. No one wanted to repeat the same situation. Representative Jasmine Crockett gained national attention, but not in a typical political way. She did not pursue attention. She used it strategically. In each media appearance, she brought the focus back to voting rights. When Trevor Noah asked about the exchange on The Daily Show, she responded by presenting a map of closed polling locations. When she appeared on The View, she brought 5 Texas voters who had faced voting challenges. The data supported her message. C-SPAN, which usually attracted around 300,000 viewers for hearings, recorded more than 45 million views of that exchange across platforms. Searches for voting rights legislation increased by 3,000%, and more than 400 town halls on voting access were organized nationwide. Younger audiences who had never followed congressional hearings began referencing parliamentary rules. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz faced a situation he was not used to: measurable consequences. Even Republican colleagues began to distance themselves. At a GOP caucus meeting, he reportedly tried to explain his actions, but was met with what one senator described as complete silence. Senator John Kennedy summarized it clearly: "When you're in a hole, stop digging." Corporate donors responded as well. 3 major Texas-based companies that had supported his campaigns announced they were reviewing their contributions. One petroleum executive, speaking anonymously to the Wall Street Journal, stated that effective representation was expected and public performance mattered. The most significant reaction came from within Texas. Just 3 days after the hearing, a statewide poll showed Cruz's approval rating had dropped by 12 points. More notably, 67% of Texas Republicans said they were dissatisfied with his conduct. At a scheduled town hall in Houston, Cruz faced an unusual situation: criticism from his own supporters. When he attempted to speak over a constituent asking about healthcare, someone in the crowd said, "That's one." The audience reacted with laughter. Cruz left the event after about 20 minutes. At the same time, the Texas Democratic Party saw record levels of volunteer sign-ups and donations. Beto O'Rourke, who had narrowly lost to Cruz in 2018, commented that Crockett had accomplished in minutes what had been difficult to achieve over a much longer campaign. Even within the Republican Party, there was reflection. Senator Marco Rubio told Politico, "We need to improve how we allow people to speak, especially when we disagree. Interrupting witnesses, particularly women and minorities, creates a negative impression and is not appropriate." Shortly after, the Senate Rules Committee held an emergency meeting to discuss limits on interruptions during testimony. Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced what became known as the Crockett Rule. Witnesses must be allowed to complete their opening statements without interruption. The measure passed unanimously, with Cruz voting in favor, although he was not present in person. 2 weeks later, a notable shift occurred. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which had been stalled for months, gained momentum. 3 Republican senators announced support for a revised version. Senator Murkowski specifically referenced Crockett's hearing, stating that it highlighted the need for a serious discussion about voting access rather than political conflict. Crockett, however, remained measured in her approach. She limited media appearances and focused on building cooperation in Congress. She met privately with Republican representatives from Texas, identifying shared priorities such as infrastructure and veteran services. "I didn't come to Washington to go viral," she told her team. "I came here to achieve results." The broader impact extended beyond politics. In corporate settings, employees, particularly women, began addressing interruptions more directly in meetings. Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Crockett Effect: How Counting Changes Conversation," reporting a 40% decrease in interruptions in workplaces where the approach was applied. Universities began using the moment in courses on political communication and leadership. A professor at Georgetown described it as an example of preparation meeting opportunity. Students studied Crockett's timing, tone, and use of evidence in detail. The impact reached international audiences as well. The BBC aired a segment on effective political communication, and a British member of parliament noted that the exchange offered useful insight. European outlets described it as a strong example of modern political messaging. 3 months later, when the voting rights bill came to a vote, an unusual development occurred. Ted Cruz chose to abstain. He did not support the bill, but he did not oppose it either. Observers suggested he wanted to avoid another direct confrontation, especially with Crockett expected to speak. The bill passed by a narrow margin of 2 votes. At the signing ceremony, Joe Biden invited Crockett to stand beside him. As he signed the legislation, he quietly remarked that in decades in the Senate, he had not seen a moment quite like that. Crockett acknowledged the comment, but remained focused. For her, the outcome was not personal. It was about expanding access to voting. Still, she allowed a brief moment of recognition. As she left the White House, a reporter asked if she had a message for Senator Cruz. She replied, "I hope he has learned that every voice deserves to be heard, without interruption." When asked if she believed he had, she added, "He has been quieter recently. That's a start." The impact continued. Political science textbooks began including the exchange as a case study in communication. A documentary team followed Crockett for a year, producing an award-winning film. Cruz, meanwhile, worked to rebuild his public image. He conducted listening tours across Texas, made a visible effort not to interrupt, and brought in a new communications team. At one event, he joked about having learned to count to 7 the hard way. However, the effect remained. In subsequent hearings, participants were more aware, and interruptions were often noted. A year later, at the Washington Press Club dinner, Crockett received the Political Moment of the Year award. In her speech, she reflected, "People ask if I planned it. The truth is, I prepared for it. You cannot script authenticity. You can only be ready when the moment comes. Senator Cruz gave me an opportunity to highlight what many people experience every day: being interrupted, overlooked, and dismissed. She paused before concluding. Sometimes the most effective action is to count. Count the interruptions, the votes, the closed polling places, and the hours people wait to vote. Make what is overlooked visible. That is how change happens, step by step. The audience responded with applause, including members from both parties. Cruz was not present. As Crockett left the stage, a young intern approached her and said, "I get interrupted often in meetings. Now I count. It helps." Crockett smiled and replied, "That's the point. Anyone can do it. You don't need a title, just awareness and the willingness to speak." The broader effect continued. Political scientists began tracking what they called an interruption index, measuring how often lawmakers interrupted witnesses based on gender, race, and age. The findings led to further reforms. In Texas, voter registration increased by 23% in counties affected by polling closures. New candidates entered politics under the message, "Every voice counts." The Texas Tribune launched a series titled After 7, documenting changes in political culture following the event. Eventually, Cruz announced he would not seek re-election, citing new opportunities. Analysts suggested declining support was a key factor. His exchange with Crockett remained a defining moment of his career. However, the lasting impact was not about one individual. It was about changes in communication standards. Hearings became more structured. Witnesses were given time to speak. "Let them finish" became a common phrase. Politics was not perfect, but it showed improvement. 5 years later, Jasmine Crockett was sworn in as a U.S. Senator from Texas, winning by a significant margin. Reflecting on that earlier moment in the New York Times, she said, "I didn't plan to become someone who counts interruptions. But sometimes, circumstances define your role." When asked if she had spoken to Cruz again, she responded with a brief smile. He called about a year later to talk. "I listened for a few minutes, then said, 'Senator, I need to interrupt you.' There was a pause. He said, 'That's fair.'" Cruz later transitioned into teaching law, including a course on civil discourse in politics. When Crockett entered the Senate chamber for her first vote, she held the same folder she had carried during that well-known hearing, filled with transcripts and data she no longer needed, but chose not to forget. For her, preparation was never only about winning arguments. It was about reshaping the rules themselves. The 7 interruptions had grown beyond a viral moment. They became a turning point in American political culture, showing that true influence is not about who speaks the loudest, but about who refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't just overcome Ted Cruz. She changed the framework for how voices are recognized in positions of power. And the message she left behind remains clear. Count the interruptions, make them visible, and never allow anyone to silence your voice.